They thought the mud would break her. Thought shoving her face first into the wet, freezing muck would humiliate her into quitting. 12 Marines, seasoned, scarred and trained to dominate, stood over her, smirking like wolves around a wounded deer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But the woman in the mud wasn't wounded, she was measuring them. Every breath, every shift of their boots, every ripple of water in the puddles between them was data. The rain had turned the training field into a swamp, the kind where your feet sucked down with every step and your hands came up slick and cold. The Marines had spent the whole morning goading her, snide remarks about her delicate hands, comments about how the mud would ruin her hair, and bets placed on how fast she'd tap out. It started with a shove from Corporal Briggs, the biggest of them. His palm hit her shoulder hard enough to send her sprawling face first into the muck. The squad laughed, the sound carrying even over the pounding rain. "Welcome to the big leagues, sweetheart," Briggs called. She didn't answer. Not with words. She pushed herself up slowly, her fingers curling into the mud, feeling the way it shifted under pressure. Her eyes rose to meet his, calm but unblinking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The instructor overseeing the drill didn't intervene. His crossed arms said everything. This wasn't just about hand-to-hand, it was about seeing if she'd break. Instead she smiled. A thin, sharp smile that made a few of the Marines falter without knowing why. "I'll give you the first move," she said, her voice low but carrying in the rain. Briggs didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, boots splashing, swinging a heavy right hook toward her jaw. She pivoted, letting the mud take some of his balance, then drove her elbow into his ribs with enough force to knock the air out of him. The laugh from the squad died instantly. Private Vance lunged next, aiming to tackle her from the side. She sidestepped, caught his arm, and used his own momentum to slam him into the mud face first. The splash was loud, the humiliation louder. The rest spread out, circling her like a pack. It wasn't in the script for all of them to attack at once, but adrenaline had burned through protocol. In the pouring rain, with the mud sucking at their boots, 12 Marines moved in. She rolled her shoulders once, loosening the muscles. Her pulse slowed instead of spiking. This wasn't chaos to her, it was rhythm. The instructor's stopwatch clicked on. The first 3 came in together, a wall of muscle and momentum. In normal conditions, that much force would have been crushing. But the mud was an equalizer. It robbed them of traction, forced their weight into every step, slowed every strike by a fraction. She needed only fractions. The Marine on the left threw a wide hook. She ducked under it, letting his own swing carry him half a step forward, then caught his wrist and wrenched it behind his back. The slick mud made his footing vanish. He went down hard, face first, with a grunt. The second man, a lean but fast corporal, tried to sweep her legs. She hopped just enough to let his boot skim under hers, then brought her knee down sharply onto his shoulder. His arm buckled, and the mud claimed him next. The third, seeing the first 2 drop, hesitated, but hesitation was blood in the water for her. She lunged forward, grabbed the front of his shirt, and yanked him off balance, twisting her hips. He landed flat on his back, the splash soaking the legs of the Marines still watching from the edge. 3 down in under 8 seconds. The squad's smirks were gone now, replaced by narrowed eyes and tight jaws. The rain plastered their hair or their skulls, the mud clung to their fatigues, but now there was a new weight in the air, wariness. Sergeant Riker stepped in next, cracking his knuckles. He'd been watching her footwork, searching for a tell. He thought he found one. He feinted high, then lunged low, arms sweeping for her legs. She planted one foot deep into the mud, and kicked sideways with the other, catching him in the ribs. The sound was muted by the rain, but his grunt was sharp. She didn't let him recover. A sharp elbow to the base of his neck sent him sprawling forward, his face splashing into the same mud he'd mocked her with minutes before. The instructor's stopwatch ticked, but his expression hadn't changed. He knew the dangerous part was coming. Not the Marines she dropped, but the point when pride made the rest attack all at once. Sure enough, the next 4 surged together. Briggs recovered and angrier, led the charge, 2 privates flanking, and a wiry lance corporal bringing up the rear. She didn't back up, she stepped forward into them. The mud slowed their feet, but her body was low and loose, gliding over the surface. She caught Briggs's wrist as he swung, pivoted, and used his own bulk to slam into the man behind him. The two went down tangled, curses flying. One of the privates tried to grab her from behind, arms locking around her waist. She dropped her weight suddenly, sinking deeper into the mud, and snapped her head backward into his chin. He staggered, grip loosening, just enough for her to grab his arm and send him flipping over her hip into the muck. The lance corporal lunged with a roar, but the roar turned into a gasp as her palm shot up under his chin, snapping his head back. He stumbled, and a shove finished him. 7 down, 5 left, all circling, mud swirling around their boots. Her breathing was steady, their breathing wasn't. The stopwatch kept running. The last 5 Marines had stopped underestimating her. They moved with tighter spacing now, forming a loose arc that cut off her retreat. No more solo heroics. This was a coordinated push, the kind they drilled for urban breaching or riot control. Their boots sank into the mud, but they kept their center of gravity low, hands half raised like wrestlers circling prey. They thought they could box her in, drown her in their combined weight. She shifted her stance, knees bent, feet light, despite the sucking muck. Her eyes moved from man to man, cataloging reach, posture, fatigue. The tallest Staff Sergeant Yarrow was anchoring the left. He'd be the slowest to adjust. The first to move was the opposite flank, a stocky corporal with quick hands. He darted in, throwing a jab meant to draw her guard. She let it pass, her head tilting just enough to feel the air of his fist brush past. Then she stepped in. Her palm slammed into his sternum, knocking the wind from him, and as he doubled forward, she hooked her arm under his and heaved. The mud turned his footing into nothing. He was on his back before his brain caught up. Yarrow tried to close the gap from the left, but she pivoted toward him instead of away. The surprise bought her an instant. She ducked low, swept his legs with a sharp kick, and let gravity take him into the muck, with a splash that sent cold water spraying over the others. 3 left. The remaining trio tightened the circle. A tall, rangy private took the center, flanked by 2 heavier Marines whose eyes never left her hands. They came in together, the private leading with a high kick, aimed at her chest. She caught his ankle midair, twisting sharply. The sudden torque ripped his balance away, sending him sprawling sideways into his own man. The heavier Marine behind him cursed, stumbled, and fell into the mud with his teammate in a tangle of limbs. Only one remained standing, but he didn't hesitate. He lunged, arms wide, aiming to grapple and pin her in the muck. She stepped inside his reach, slammed her forearm into his throat, and shoved. The move sent him staggering back, arms flailing for balance, before he landed flat on his back with a splash that echoed over the field. 12 Marines down. The rain continued to pour, running in rivulets down her face, dripping from her hair into the mud. Her chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, not from exhaustion, but from control. The stopwatch clicked off. From the sideline, the instructor stepped forward. His boots squelched with every step, but his expression was unreadable. Behind him, the rest of the training platoon stared in silence, some wide-eyed, others looking anywhere but at her. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She simply straightened, adjusted her soaked fatigues, and waited. Because this wasn't the end, this was just the opening act. The rain hadn't stopped, but the laughter and trash talk from earlier were gone. All that remained was the heavy breathing of 12 Marines, sprawled in the mud, and the quiet authority of the man walking toward her. The instructor stopped a few feet away. He was older than most of the men she'd just floored, his hair cut short and flecked with gray. His face was carved from stone, deep lines around his eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been set more than once. "Name," he said. She gave it, her tone clipped. He didn't write it down, didn't have to. "You've done hand-to-hand before." It wasn't a question. She kept her expression neutral. "Yes, sir." "Where?" "Overseas." Not with the Corps. That earned her a long, measuring look. The kind where you could feel the person behind it weighing every word you'd ever spoken. Then he glanced past her to the Marines still dragging themselves upright. "U-12, he barked. "Tell me exactly how many seconds she gave you before she put you in the mud." No one spoke. The only answer was the sound of rain hitting the flooded ground. He turned back to her. "You know what this was?" She said nothing. "It wasn't a drill. It was an assessment." He stepped closer, his boots sinking into the muck. "You were observed from the moment you walked onto this field. Not by me, by them." He gestured with a tilt of his head. On the edge of the training ground, two figures stood under a black umbrella, both in dark coats, their faces unreadable in the rain. They hadn't been there before, or maybe she just hadn't noticed them. "They're not Marines," he said, "and they don't care about your service record. They care about what you just did to 12 men who didn't want to lose." One of the figures under the umbrella raised a hand slightly. The instructor gave a single nod in return. "Dry off," he told her. "You'll be summoned." She opened her mouth to ask what for, but the look he gave her said she'd find out soon enough. The Marines she'd fought avoided her eyes as she walked past, the mud pulling at her boots with every step. Even Briggs, still wiping grime from his face, said nothing. She didn't know it yet, but the next time she stepped onto a training field, the stakes wouldn't be bruised pride or cold rain. They'd be life and death. 2 days later, a plain black SUV pulled up outside the barracks. No plates, no insignia. The driver didn't speak when she climbed in, just glanced at her through the rearview mirror before pulling away. They drove in silence for over an hour, leaving the base perimeter and cutting through back roads that wound deeper into the pine forest. The rain from that day had passed, but the sky was still low and gray, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Eventually the road narrowed until it seemed to vanish altogether, swallowed by trees. But the SUV didn't slow. It rolled over cracked asphalt until they reached a squat concrete structure half hidden by brush. No windows, one steel door. The driver stopped. "Go inside," he said, his voice flat and low. When she stepped out, he pulled away, without waiting for a reply. The steel door opened with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a narrow corridor, lit by strips of harsh white light. At the far end, a woman in a black uniform waited, her hair pulled back in a perfect knot. The uniform bore no name, no rank, no branch insignia. "This way," the woman said, turning sharply on her heel. They passed through a series of checkpoints, each door thicker than the last, each requiring a code and a hand scan. She counted 7 in total. By the time they reached the final room, she was starting to understand whatever this was. It wasn't on any base she'd ever been to. The room beyond was wide and empty, the floor polished concrete, the walls lined with lockers and racks of unmarked equipment. 2 figures stood at the center, a tall man in a dark suit, and a shorter woman wearing the same black uniform as her escort. The man spoke first. "You're here because we watched you drop 12 Marines in less than 2 minutes. We want to know how." She studied him, the suit, the neutral tone, the lack of small talk. This was someone used to skipping past formalities. "I fought smarter," she said. The corner of his mouth twitched. "That's one way of putting it." The woman beside him stepped forward. "We're not here to offer you a commendation. We're here to offer you a choice." She gestured toward a metal case on a nearby table. Inside were 2 items, a sealed envelope, and a matte black access card. "Take the envelope. You go back to your life. No questions asked." She tapped the card. "Take this, and you'll never go back to your life. Not as it is now." The man's eyes were steady on hers. "If you take the card, you'll train for missions that don't officially exist. You'll go places you can't name and work with people who aren't supposed to be alive. You'll be bound by nothing, except results." Her gaze flicked between the envelope and the card. The air in the room was still heavy. One choice meant safety. The other meant stepping into the unknown. She reached forward, her fingers closed around the black access card. It was heavier than it looked. Metal, not plastic. Its surface engraved with a series of faint, precise lines that didn't form any symbol she recognized. The man in the suit gave the faintest nod. "Follow the sergeant." The woman in black turned and led her out of the room. They passed through another steel door into a space that felt different from the sterile corridors before. This one carried the tang of oil, metal, and sweat. The lighting was dimmer, the air warmer. It wasn't an office, it was a proving ground. Rows of equipment lined one wall, padded mats, climbing rigs and racks of weapons locked behind reinforced glass. The center of the room was open, except for a series of uneven obstacles and low barricades. 5 figures in black training gear stood scattered across it, each wearing headgear, with dark visors that concealed their faces. The sergeant spoke without looking back at her. "You're going to cross this floor from here to the far door. They're going to stop you. You will not be armed." "They will." Her eyes narrowed. "What kind of weapons?" The sergeant's tone didn't change, blunt and edged. "They will not pull strikes." The man in the suit's voice carried from the observation deck above. "If you make it to the door, you stay. If you don't, you walk away. No second chances." The far door was a good 30 meters away. The enemies spread out in a loose semicircle between her and it, each shifting slightly on their feet, loose but alert. She rolled her shoulders once, feeling the familiar coil of focus settle in her chest. Mud had been her ally last time. Here she'd have to find a new one. The sergeant stepped back. "Go." The first 2 moved immediately, one charging low, the other swinging wide to flank. She sidestepped the low charge, letting him overcommit, and brought her elbow down hard into the back of his neck. He hit the mat face first. The second came in with a training blade, slashing in tight arcs. She stayed just outside the reach, baiting him into a forward lunge, then hooked his wrist, twisted sharply, and drove her knee into his ribs. The knife clattered away. 3 left, one advanced cautiously, the other 2 circling. She darted forward, feinting at the cautious one, then pivoted hard to catch the man at her flank. A quick palm strike to his visor staggered him. She followed with a sweep that took his legs out. 2 left. They came together, fast and aggressive, one swinging a short staff, the other with open hands. She stepped into the staff's arc, letting it glance off her shoulder, and used the momentum to grab the wielder's forearm and drag him forward into the path of his partner. Both went down in a tangle of limbs. Her breathing was steady as she crossed the rest of the mat. She touched the far door and turned. The 5 were already on their feet, visors lifted to reveal grim but respectful expressions. On the deck above, the man in the suit was smiling faintly. "Welcome to the program." The next 3 weeks erased any idea she had of training as she knew it. This wasn't about push-ups, long runs, or even the brutal obstacle courses of standard military prep. This was about unlearning, stripping away every habit, every reflex, every rule she'd been taught, and rebuilding her from the ground up. The instructors weren't Marines. Some had never been in uniform at all. One had the calm, distant manner of a surgeon, moving with precise economy. Another spoke with an accent she couldn't place, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had survived wars without ever being in an army. Every day was different. One morning, they dropped her in a pitch-black warehouse and told her she had 10 minutes to find her way out, while 4 opponents hunted her. They didn't pull their strikes. She learned to use sound and texture, the scrape of boots on concrete, the shift of air against a hanging tarp to stay 1 step ahead. Another day, they cuffed her wrists, blindfolded her, and dumped her into a tank of cold water. No warning, no explanation. She surfaced once before a hand shoved her under again. When they finally let her up, she wasn't gasping, she was counting in her head, timing her breath, measuring her limits. Weapons training was unlike anything she'd known. They didn't just hand her a rifle and run her through drills. They gave her unfamiliar weapons, curved blades, compact crossbows, pistols she'd never seen before, and expected her to adapt in seconds. If she hesitated, the instructor switched mid-exercise, forcing her to drop one weapon and pick up another without breaking flow. By the end of the second week, she stopped thinking in terms of techniques and started thinking in terms of outcomes. The mud fight had taught her adaptability. This was teaching her something sharper. Efficiency. The physical toll was brutal. Muscles she didn't know she had screamed every night. Her knuckles split, her knees bruised, her ribs bore the deep ache of too many blows absorbed in sparring matches. But the mental strain was worse. They never told her the schedule, never told her when the next drill would start or end.
She learned to eat when she could, sleep in short bursts, and trust nothing until it was in her hand. The other recruits, if that's what they were, came and went. Some lasted days. A few lasted weeks. She noticed the instructors never used names. You were either here, or you weren't. At the end of the third week, the man in the suit called her into an empty room. The table between them held a single item, a black and white photograph of a man she'd never seen before. Underneath, an address scrawled on a scrap of paper. No uniform, no weapon, he said. Retrieve something from him. You have 24 hours. She looked at the photograph, then at him. What am I retrieving? He smiled without warmth. You'll know when you see it.
The address took her to the outskirts of a decaying industrial district, where rusted warehouses leaned like tired sentinels over cracked asphalt. It was the kind of place where the streetlights hummed but barely lit the ground, and every shadow felt like it had weight. She wore plain jeans, a weathered jacket, and scuffed boots. No uniform, no gear. Her only tools were her eyes, her hands, and the small folding knife she'd slipped into her pocket against the rules. The man from the photograph emerged just before dusk, locking a metal door behind him. He was taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered, his coat too heavy for the mild air. He moved with the kind of ease you didn't get from office work. She followed at a distance, using the gaps between buildings and the cover of parked trucks. He didn't glance back once, but something in the way his head angled, just slightly, told her he knew the street like the back of his hand. After 6 blocks, he ducked into a side alley. She closed the gap, steps soft, her breathing shallow. Halfway in, she froze. The sound of metal sliding against brick was faint but sharp. She looked up just in time to see a length of pipe swinging down toward her head. She moved left, the pipe grazing her shoulder instead of caving her skull. Pain flared, but she was already stepping inside the attacker's arc, driving her elbow into his ribs. The pipe clanged to the ground as he gasped. It wasn't the man from the photo, it was someone else, a lookout, maybe. Footsteps pounded deeper in the alley. She sprinted after them, rounding a corner into a narrower passage choked with dumpsters. The man from the photo was there, pulling something from his coat, not a gun. A small black case, about the size of a hardback book. She didn't have time to think. She lunged, tackling him into the side of a dumpster. The case slipped from his grip and hit the ground with a dull thud. He fought hard, fists, elbows, a knee that almost took her off balance, but she'd fought men his size before. A quick shift of weight, a twist of his wrist, and she had him face first against the metal, his arm pinned high behind his back. "What's in the case?" she demanded. He spat mud from the alley floor. "Not yours to know." She tightened the pressure until his shoulders trembled. Then she scooped up the case and backed away, keeping her eyes on him until she was out of the alley and back on the main street. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The test wasn't about the contents. It was about whether she could take it without backup, without weapons, and without hesitation. 20 minutes later, she placed the case on the table in the same empty room where the assignment had been given. The man in the suit looked at it, then at her. "You didn't open it," he said. "No," she replied. A faint smile ghosted across his face. "Good, you pass." The next morning, she was escorted to a different part of the facility, a place she hadn't seen before. It wasn't a training hall or briefing room. It was a map room. The walls were covered in large screens, each displaying different parts of the globe. Red dots pulsed across cities and coastlines. Some were labeled, others were not. The man in the suit stood near the center, speaking quietly with a pair of analysts. When he saw her, he waved the others away. "You've been wondering who we are," he said. "You've earned the answer." He walked toward one of the screens, tapping a point in the middle of the Indian Ocean. "This isn't on any news feed. 3 weeks ago, a freighter here was boarded by a hostile unit that technically doesn't exist. They took something we can't afford to let disappear." He turned to her. "What you did in the mud wasn't just impressive. It showed us something rare, the ability to adapt instantly under pressure, to use the environment instead of fighting against it. That's what we recruit for." Her arms crossed loosely, and the 5 in the training room. "A control group," he said without hesitation. We run the same test on dozens of candidates, only a fraction make it across. He gestured toward another wall screen. This one showed surveillance stills of a variety of people, men in business suits, women in street clothes, armed escorts moving through airports. Some images were grainy, some crystal clear. These aren't enemies in uniform, he said. They're ghosts, people who operate between countries, using influence, money and violence to shift events without leaving fingerprints. We tracked them, we stopped them. She studied the faces. One of them, a woman in a tailored coat, was circled in red. That's your first field target, he said. She's a broker, moves weapons through civilian fronts. You'll meet her at a safe house in the outskirts of Marseille. She doesn't know you're coming. He handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a passport under a different name, a boarding pass, and a small flash drive. You'll have no official cover, he said. If you're caught, you were never here. She closed the envelope slowly. And if I succeed, then Marseille will just be the start. For the first time since the mud fight, she felt the weight of what she'd stepped into. No ranks, no medals, just missions, and every one of them would test whether she was as good as they thought she was. Marseille was a city of contrasts, white limestone facades glowing under the sun, narrow streets twisting like veins between ancient buildings, and the constant scent of salt and diesel drifting from the harbor. She moved through it like she belonged, her plain black jacket blending with the steady flow of pedestrians. The safe house was on the edge of the Pannier district, hidden behind a faded blue storefront that sold nothing but dusty postcards. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cleaning solvent and old paper. A narrow staircase led up to a single room with a table, 2 chairs, and a window that faced the street. She arrived early, scanning the angles, noting the exits. The envelope's instructions had been clear. The target would arrive alone. She didn't believe it. 10 minutes later, she saw her. The woman from the photograph, dark hair tied back, gray coat buttoned to the neck, walked down the narrow street without hurry. She carried a leather bag in one hand. When the door opened, the woman stepped inside without speaking, her eyes sweeping the room once before settling on her. "You're earlier than I expected," the woman said in accented French. "I don't like surprises," she replied. The woman's gaze flicked to the leather bag. "Then you won't like this one." She dropped the bag on the table and unzipped it. Inside was a neat stack of files and a compact pistol wrapped in cloth. Before she could react, the woman's eyes darted past her to the window. "Move." It wasn't a warning to her, it was a signal. The glass shattered a heartbeat later, as 2 men in dark clothing burst through. One landed inside the room, swinging a baton. The other remained outside, pulling a subcompact SMG from under his jacket. She moved first, catching the baton mid-swing, and twisting hard. The man's wrist popped, he shouted, and she drove her shoulder into his chest, sending him sprawling backward into the street. The SMG barked once, a burst shredding the window frame. She grabbed the table, flipped it onto its side, and dragged the woman down behind it. "You set me up," she hissed. The woman shook her head sharply. "They followed me. I don't know how." Footsteps pounded up the stairs. More were coming. She checked the pistol in the bag, snapped off the safety, and tossed the files onto the floor. "Stay here," she told the woman. She stepped into the hall just as 2 more men rounded the landing. The first swung a knife. She sidestepped, hooked his arm, and sent him tumbling down the stairs into the second. Both crashed into the wall at the bottom. She didn't wait for them to recover. She sprinted back into the room, grabbed the woman by the arm, and yanked her toward the back exit. They burst into a narrow alley, the smell of seawater stronger here. A black van roared into view at the far end, its sliding door already open. She shoved the woman behind her, and reached into her jacket for the flash drive. It was still there. The mission had changed. Forget the files, the objective now was staying alive. The van gunned forward, tires screeching against the worn cobblestones. She didn't waste time pulling the woman along the straight path. Instead, she yanked her into a narrow side passage between 2 crumbling apartment blocks. The alley was barely wide enough for a scooter, let alone a vehicle. Shouts echoed behind them, more men on foot. She scanned the walls as they ran. A drain pipe clung to the side of one building, its rusted brackets groaning under years of salt air. She grabbed it, swung one boot onto the bricks, and scrambled upward. "Climb," she ordered. The woman hesitated only a moment before following. The pipe shook under their combined weight, but they made it to the second-floor balcony, just as a pair of pursuers rounded the corner below. One raised a pistol. She ripped a potted plant from the railing and hurled it down. The heavy ceramic struck his shoulder with a sick crack, sending him spinning into the wall. She pulled the woman over the balcony and into the apartment beyond. The startled occupant, a wiry old man with a cigarette hanging from his lip, froze as she raised a finger to her lips. "Kitchen," she whispered. He nodded once and stepped aside. They cut through the cramped space, out the back door, and into another maze of alleys. The smell of frying fish mixed with diesel exhaust here. Voices rose from open windows above, oblivious to the chase below. She spotted a market square ahead, its stalls cluttered with crates of produce, hanging fabrics, and buckets of ice. Crowds, cover. They slipped into the throng just as another group of men entered from the far side. She grabbed a scarf from a vendor's rack, wrapped it around her head and mouth, and draped another over the woman. "Keep moving," she murmured. The men scanned the crowd, splitting up to check between the stalls. She used the moment to duck behind a cart loaded with melons. When one of the pursuers drew close, she rolled a melon under his feet. He slipped, crashing into the stall, and sending fruit scattering in all directions. The distraction bought them seconds. They slipped through a gap between two vendors and into a shaded courtyard. Here, the sound of the harbor was closer, the slap of waves, the metallic creak of rigging. Boats. She guided the woman toward a narrow stairwell that descended to a service dock. A single fishing boat bobbed at the end, its owner smoking idly on deck. She tossed him a thick roll of euros from her pocket without breaking stride. "Take us out," she said. The man looked at the cash, then at their faces, and didn't ask a single question. Within moments, the boat's motor rumbled to life, pulling them away from the dock as shouts erupted from the street above. From the water she watched the men run to the edge, scanning for them. Too late. The woman beside her finally spoke, voice tight. "They'll come again." She nodded. "That's why we're not going back to the safe house." The fishing boat cut across the harbor's mouth, its small motor buzzing against the low rumble of distant cargo ships. The afternoon light painted the water in bands of golden shadow, but she wasn't looking at the view. Her eyes kept sweeping the horizon. The woman sat opposite her on a coil of rope, coat pulled tight. She hadn't let go of the leather bag, even after the chase. "You going to tell me what's in there?" she asked. "It's not about what's in it," the woman replied quietly. "It's about who wants it." The boat's owner kept his gaze forward, cigarette smoke trailing over his shoulder. For a moment, the only sounds were the water against the hull and the gulls overhead. Then she saw it, a black shape sliding out from behind a moored freighter, moving fast. Too low to be a fishing vessel, too sleek to be anything but trouble. "Keep going," she told the captain. The other boat closed the distance with frightening speed. 3 men were visible on deck, all dressed in dark waterproof gear. One held a grappling hook, another had something longer, an assault rifle wrapped in plastic. "Get down," she barked. The first burst of gunfire ripped across the water, sending splinters of wood into the air. The captain dropped flat, hands over his head. She grabbed the nearest length of rope and swung it up, looping it over a cleat. When the grappling hook arced toward them, she yanked the rope, pulling the boat sharply to the side. The hook missed the railing, splashing harmlessly into the sea. The attackers adjusted course, coming in on the opposite flank. This time, she didn't wait. She vaulted to the bow, grabbed a heavy metal fishing gaff, and planted her feet. As the boat scraped hulls, one man leapt across the gap. She met him midair, swinging the gaff like a spear. The hook caught the straps of his vest, and with a sharp twist, she sent him spinning into the water between the boats.
The second man swung a rifle toward her, but the captain, still on his knees, kicked the throttle. The sudden jolt slammed the two boats apart, throwing the riflemen off balance. She closed the distance in 2 steps, driving the butt of the gaff into his chest. He hit the deck gasping, weapons skidding overboard. The last attacker hesitated just long enough for her to grab the coiled rope and whip it across the gap. The weighted end caught him across the face, knocking him backward. By the time the black boat steadied itself, they were already speeding toward open water, the gap between them widening with each second. She leaned the gaff against the rail and looked back. The 3 men were regrouping, but none of them were in a position to follow immediately. The woman clutched the leather bag tighter. "They won't stop." She nodded. "Then neither will we." They made landfall under the cover of dusk, the small fishing boat sliding into a rocky inlet where the sea met jagged cliffs. There was no dock here, just a narrow stretch of shingle and the yawning mouth of a cave. The captain killed the motor without a word, gesturing toward the shadows. "This is as far as I go." She nodded, passed him another roll of cash, and guided the woman onto the shore. The air was cooler here. The wind funneled through the cliffs in long, low moans. Inside the cave, the walls glistened with damp. A narrow path led deeper until it opened into a natural chamber where someone had set up a makeshift safe point, folding table, a pair of camp chairs, and a battered oil lamp that flickered in the gloom. She waited until the sound of the boat's motor had faded entirely before turning to the woman. "Now," she said, her tone flat. "What's in the bag?" The woman hesitated, eyes darting toward the cave's entrance, as if expecting someone to appear. Then with slow, deliberate motions, she placed the leather bag on the table and unzipped it. Inside was a steel case, no bigger than a lunchbox, sealed with 2 combination locks. She reached for it, but the woman's hand shot out to stop her. "Don't open it here, the signal's too strong." She frowned. "Signal," the woman exhaled. "It's not money, not documents, it's a drive, solid state, military grade, containing targeting algorithms for an experimental drone network. If it's activated, every system it's paired to will wake up. And how many drones are we talking? Enough to erase a city in under an hour." The weight of the words hung in the damp air. She'd handled dangerous intel before, but this was different. This wasn't a weapon in the wrong hands, it was a swarm. "Who did you take it from?" she asked. The woman's jaw tightened. "A private contractor. Not military, not government. They sell to the highest bidder, and they were about to close a deal that would have started a war no one was ready for." She leaned back slightly, processing. "And you were going to deliver it to who?" "That's where you come in," the woman said quietly. "You weren't supposed to save me. You were supposed to take this and get it to someone who can destroy it." The pieces clicked into place, the target photo, the lack of backup, the sudden ambush in Marseille. She hadn't been sent to capture the woman, she'd been sent to protect the bag. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant thrum of an engine, not a fishing boat. Something larger. She stood, hand on the gaff still leaning against the wall. "Looks like they found us." The woman's gaze dropped to the steel case. "Then we can't stay here." The engine's growl was closer now, bouncing off the cliffs in fractured echoes. She killed the oil lamp, plunging the cave into darkness. The only light came from the faint shimmer of moon on wet stone. "Stay close," she told the woman, slinging the leather bag over her own shoulder. They moved toward the narrow path at the back of the cave, a fissure that climbed steeply toward the cliff tops. The rock was slick, the air thick with salt spray. Behind them the sound of boots on shingle reached her ears. Multiple pairs, the hunters were inside. Halfway up, she paused, pressing herself against the stone. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness below, sweeping across the cave's entrance. She counted 4 shadows. They were moving slow, careful, too careful. She waited until the beam turned away, then motioned for the woman to keep climbing. The path narrowed to little more than a ledge, the sea crashing far below. The wind tugged at their clothes, threatening to pull them off balance. At the top the path forked, one trail leading inland toward scrub-covered hills, the other hugging the cliff edge. She chose the latter. In the dark, with the sea at their side, they could move quieter. But the hunters were close. She could hear them climbing, the scrape of boots on stone. One of them dislodged a rock. It skittered down the cliff face, splashing into the sea. She spotted a narrow overhang ahead, just deep enough to hide in. They pressed themselves into it, barely breathing, as two of the hunters passed within arm's reach. The smell of gun oil drifted with them. When the last one passed, she stepped out silently, hooked her arm around his neck, and yanked him backward into the dark. He went limp before he could make a sound. She lowered him to the ground, and stripped the pistol from his holster. Now armed, she moved faster, leading the woman along the cliff, until they reached a sheer drop. Far below, the water churned white against the rocks. Ahead, the trail descended sharply toward a narrow spit of land, where a single light glowed, probably a fisherman's hut. The woman hesitated at the drop. "They'll see us if we go down there. They'll see us anywhere if we stay still," she replied. They descended, half sliding, half running, until their boots hit sand. The light from the hut grew brighter, and for the first time, all night she felt a flicker of hope. Then a shot cracked from above, shattering the hut's window. Splinters flew. The hunters had found their angle. She shoved the woman toward the door. Inside, the second she crossed the threshold, she turned, raised the pistol, and fired back toward the cliffs. The muzzle flash lit the rocks for an instant, enough to see at least 3 silhouettes. "Get that bag hidden," she said, stepping fully into the open. "If they want it, they'll have to come through me." The hunters came down the cliff fast, using ropes to control their descent. Moonlight glinted on metal, rifles, knives, gear that spoke of precision and intent. They weren't here to scare her, they were here to finish it. She stepped out from the hut, feet sinking slightly into the wet sand. The sound of the surf masked her movement, until she was already at the waterline, crouched low, pistol steady. The first man hit the sand, and broke right, using a dune for cover. She let him move, eyes locked on the second, who landed heavier, rifle swinging toward the hut. One shot dropped him before he could sight in. Shouts erupted, the third and fourth split wide, trying to flank. She sprinted for the dune, catching the first man by surprise. They collided hard, his rifle clattering into the sand. A quick elbow to the jaw sent him sprawling, and she scooped up the weapon without breaking stride. Gunfire tore through the night, splintering the hut's doorframe. Inside, the woman crouched behind an overturned table, the steel case clutched to her chest. The last 2 hunters regrouped near the base of the cliff, their fire disciplined, forcing her into the shallow water for cover. She dropped flat, letting the waves wash over her legs, and crawled along the surf line until she was parallel with their position. When she came up, it was fast. A short burst from the captured rifle sent one spinning into the sand. The last man ducked, but she was already moving, closing the distance before he could reload. They hit the ground together, the rifle wedged between them. He was strong, trained, but she'd fought in worse conditions. A shift of her hips, a twist of her wrist, and the rifle came free. She jammed the stock into his throat, pinning him until the fight drained out of his limbs. Silence settled over the beach, broken only by the crash of waves. She stood slowly, scanning the cliff for movement. Nothing. They were done. Back inside the hut, the woman's eyes searched her face. "Is it over? For tonight," she said, lowering the rifle. "But they'll keep coming until this thing is gone." She looked at the steel case, its twin locks glinting in the flickering lamplight. Destroying it wouldn't be easy, but neither was surviving 12 Marines in the mud. She had done that. She could do this.
The desert training grounds were quiet, too quiet. After the fight in the mud pit, and the chaos that followed, she had expected the brass to call her in immediately, to demand an explanation or to lock her in confinement until they figured out what to do with her. Bits de prowlers, or two. Instead, she'd been left alone in a Spartan barracks room for 2 days. No word, no orders. just the sound of boots and distant gunfire outside. On the morning of the third day, a knock came at the door. When she opened it, two men in plain fatigues stood there, no rank insignia, no names on their uniforms. "Come with us," the taller one said. She didn't ask where they were going. She'd been in the military long enough to know when a question wouldn't get an answer. They led her out past the training grounds, beyond the live fire ranges, to a stretch of sand and scrub that seemed empty. Then the taller man reached into his pocket, pressed something on a remote, and a section of dune shifted aside, revealing a concrete ramp descending into the earth. They walked her into a facility that felt different from anything she'd ever seen. Low-lit, corridors lined with security doors, cameras in every corner, and a faint hum in the air that made her skin prickle. She passed rooms where soldiers were sparring in total silence, their movements impossibly fast and precise. Other rooms held strange weaponry, shapes she couldn't name, laid out on black tables under surgical lights. Finally, they brought her into a briefing room where a single man sat waiting. His hair was silver, his uniform immaculate, but his eyes were sharp and cold. "Sergeant Reyes," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "You've been making waves." She said nothing. He studied her for a long moment. "That display against my Marines wasn't just strength, it was technique, adapted, improvised, refined. You've trained somewhere that isn't in your file." Her jaw tightened. "You read my file. I wrote most of it," he said evenly. "But the parts I didn't write are what interest me." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, grainy, long-lens shots of her in a dozen different locations over the past 5 years. Some were in uniform, some weren't, all were somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. "You're a survivor," he said. "You've seen more than most soldiers do in 3 careers, and you did it without breaking. That's why you're here." She closed the folder and pushed it back toward him. "And where exactly is here?" "A proving ground," he said, "for something beyond the Marines, beyond any branch you've known. We take the best and break them again, not to destroy them, but to make sure they can't be broken anymore." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Sounds familiar." He leaned forward. "You survived the mud. Let's see if you can survive the sand." They gave her no prep time, no briefing, just a set of sand-colored fatigues, a hydration pack, and a sidearm with 1 magazine. The silver-haired officer from the briefing simply said, "Survive until extraction," and sent her through a blast door into blinding sunlight. The heat hit her like a fist. The desert stretched in every direction, dunes rolling into jagged rock outcroppings under a sky so clear it hurt to look at. She could already feel sweat beading on her neck as she scanned the horizon. There was no sign of a training range, no bleachers, no watchtowers, no safety nets. A low hum made her glance upward. Far above, a drone circled, its lens glinting in the sun. She knew instantly she was being watched. Every movement, every decision, every hesitation would be recorded. She moved toward the rocks, keeping low, using the uneven ground to break line of sight. The sand was soft, dragging at her boots with every step, and the heat made her mouth go dry almost immediately. She'd been in deserts before, but never without a map or water caches. This was meant to wear her down before the real challenge began. The first shot came from her left, sharp, close, the crack of a rifle. She dove behind a boulder, feeling grit spray her face as a second round chipped stone inches from her head. Whoever was shooting wasn't using blanks. She risked a glance and saw them, 3 figures in desert camo, moving fast along the ridgeline. Their gear didn't match any unit she knew, and their rifles looked custom, stripped down for speed. So this wasn't a simulation, this was live fire. Her sidearm felt too light in her hand, the single magazine a reminder that she couldn't waste shots. She waited, breathing slow, until the first figure broke cover to advance. 2 quick rounds, center mass, dropped him into the sand. The others scattered, one diving behind a dune, the other disappearing into a cluster of rocks. She moved fast and low, using the fallen attacker's body as cover long enough to strip his rifle and spare mags. The weapon was warm, the sand clinging to its stock, but it was a real rifle with real stopping power. The drone above hummed lower now, following her closely. She ignored it, keeping her eyes on the rocks where the second shooter had vanished. When he popped up to fire, she was already sighted in. 1 clean shot, and he was down. The last one tried to flank her, moving wide through the dunes. She let him get close, close enough to think he had the advantage, before rising from cover and putting 2 rounds through his shoulder. He dropped the rifle, clutching the wound, and she closed the distance in seconds. Her boot hit his chest, knocking him flat. "Who sent you?" she demanded. He didn't answer, just gave a thin, bloody smile. "You think you're being tested?" Before she could press him, the sound of rotor blades cut through the air. A black helicopter swept in low, its downwash blasting sand in all directions. 2 men in black armor jumped out, dragging the wounded shooter aboard before she could react. The chopper lifted off, banking hard toward the horizon, leaving her alone in the swirling sand. If this was a test, the rules had just changed. The black helicopter was already a speck against the blazing blue when she reached the top of the ridge. From here the desert rolled out for miles, but she spotted it, a faint swirl of dust on the horizon, where the chopper's downwash had kicked up sand during its low pass. That meant it had landed somewhere not far beyond the next stretch of jagged hills. She checked the gear she'd scavenged from the fallen shooters, a half-full canteen, 2 spare rifle mags, and a knife that looked like it had seen decades of use. Not much, but enough to get her there if she moved fast. The heat was relentless. By the time she crossed the first set of dunes, sweat was stinging her eyes and her mouth felt like cotton. Every step in the sand took twice the effort, and the high sun burned the back of her neck. But she kept going, driven less by orders and more by instinct, the same instinct that had kept her alive in places where most soldiers never returned. An hour later, she was lying prone at the edge of a rocky outcrop, peering down at a hidden basin. In the center was a temporary landing zone, a flat patch of packed earth ringed with camo netting, a handful of shipping crates stacked at the edge. The black helicopter sat there, rotors still spinning lazily. 2 men in black armor stood guard while a third, tall, broad-shouldered, with a clean-shaven head, spoke to the wounded shooter she'd tagged in the shoulder. The wounded man's arm was in a sling now, but he looked calm, even defiant. She eased down the slope, keeping to the shadows. When she reached the edge of the basin, she caught snippets of their conversation. "Didn't break," the wounded man was saying, faster than the others. The tall man's voice was low but carried authority. "She's different. I told them the mud wasn't enough. The desert bull tell us." Her pulse quickened. They weren't just testing her, they were orchestrating it, step by step, like she was a piece on a board they already controlled. A shout broke her focus. One of the guards had spotted movement. She wasn't sure if it was her or the dust she'd kicked up. Either way, rifles came up, and she was forced to drop into the sand as the first rounds cracked past her head. She rolled into cover behind a crate, returning fire in short, sharp bursts. One guard went down, but the other used the helicopter for cover, firing back with disciplined precision. The tall man didn't flinch, he simply barked an order into a radio, and somewhere beyond the basin, an engine roared to life. She didn't need to see it to know. Reinforcements. Outnumbered, low on water, she had seconds to decide. She pulled a smoke grenade from one of the fallen shooter's pouches, yanked the pin, and rolled it toward the center of the basin. Thick gray clouds erupted, swallowing the guards and the helicopter in a haze. She used the chaos to slip back up the slope, every muscle in her body screaming from the sprint. By the time the smoke cleared, she was already gone, moving deeper into the desert. But the image of that tall man stayed with her, calm, certain, like someone who already knew the ending of this story. She swore to herself that when they met again, it would be on her terms. The sun was dipping toward the horizon when she saw it, half buried in sand, the jagged silhouette of an old forward operations post. It had been abandoned for years, maybe decades, but its shape was unmistakable. Low concrete walls, rusted antenna towers, and a collapsed gate still bearing the faded markings of a unit long decommissioned. She approached cautiously, rifle raised. The place was silent, except for the whisper of wind pushing sand through cracks in the structure. Inside, the air was cooler, the concrete holding the day's heat at bay. Her boots crunched over scattered shell casings, empty ration tins, and the skeletal remains of old comms gear. Whoever had left here had done it in a hurry. Maps were still pinned to the walls, their edges curled and brittle, marking positions that didn't exist anymore. She swept the main room and found a storage alcove in the back,
the door half off its hinges. Inside was a metal footlocker, locked with a heavy padlock that had rusted almost through. It took only a few strikes with the butt of her rifle to break it open. The contents were strange. Bundles of faded photographs, a set of notebooks, each filled with careful handwriting in a language she didn't immediately recognize. And at the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, a small field radio, still intact, its battery compartment clean. She sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through the notebook. The handwriting was neat but urgent, and while she couldn't read most of it, certain words jumped out: her old unit designation, a string of coordinates, and a name she hadn't heard in years. The tall man from the basin, so he'd been here before, and not as an enemy. The hairs on the back of her neck rose. This wasn't random. He had history in this desert, in this exact outpost. And if these notebooks were telling the truth, he'd been running operations out here, long before she ever set foot in the mud pit. She was still turning that over, when the sound of crunching gravel made her freeze. Someone was outside. She killed the small light she'd been using, sinking into the shadows, as the steps drew closer. Two voices, male speaking low, not in English. They entered through the same doorway she had, their silhouettes visible against the fading orange light outside. They weren't scavengers. Their gear was modern, clean, and their rifles were the same stripped-down models used by the shooters in the desert, which meant they were part of the same operation. One moved toward the storage alcove. She waited until he was 2 steps away, before surging forward, slamming him into the wall hard enough to knock the rifle from his hands. The second spun toward her, but she was already moving, driving the edge of the locker lid into his knee before sweeping him to the floor. Both men were down before either could fire a shot. She stripped them of weapons, water, and a compact satellite beacon, military grade, unmarked. Her thumb hovered over the beacon's activation switch. It would give away her position, but it might also bring exactly the kind of attention she wanted. After a long moment, she pressed it. If they were hunting her, then she'd make sure they knew exactly where to find her, on her ground. The desert night fell fast, swallowing the horizon in deep blue shadows. She crouched on the roof of the abandoned outpost, rifle balanced across her knees, eyes fixed on the dark line of dunes to the south. The satellite beacon at her side blinked steadily, its signal cutting a silent thread into the sky. They would come. She was counting on it. The first sign was a distant growl, engines moving over sand. Through her skull, she caught the faint glint of headlights before they went dark. Whoever was driving knew how to approach without giving away their exact position. She stayed still, every muscle loose but ready, breathing slow. Patience was the difference between winning and dying. Minutes later, figures emerged from the dunes. 6 men, their silhouettes distinct even in the dim light. 5 carried rifles. The 6th walked at the center, unarmed, his posture relaxed. Even without seeing his face, she knew it was the tall man. He stopped 20 meters from the outpost, his voice carrying in the still night air. "You've been busy." She didn't move. "You've been sloppy." That drew a small smile from him, one she could just make out in the faint moonlight. "Sloppy? No. Deliberate. Every step you've taken was one I wanted you to take. The mud, the desert, even this outpost." She stood slowly, rifle still in hand. "You're not as smart as you think." The smile widened. "Then shoot me. End it." Her finger tightened on the trigger, but she didn't fire. That was the real game here. He wanted her to take the shot, to cross whatever line they'd been nudging her toward since the first day. She lowered the rifle slightly, shifting her aim to the ground at his feet. The single shot cracked the silence, kicking up a spray of sand. The 5 riflemen reacted instantly, scattering for cover. She dropped behind the roof parapet, returning fire in quick bursts, using the old outpost concrete as a shield. 2 went down in the first exchange. The others tried to flank, but she anticipated their movement, moving along the roofline and catching them in a crossfire as they cleared the corner. By the time the last one fell, the air smelled of cordite and hot metal. When she looked back to the center of the dunes, the tall man was gone. No footprints led away from where he'd stood. It was as if he'd vanished into the night. She descended to the ground level, scanning the darkness, ears straining for any sound beyond the wind. Nothing. But in the sand where he had stood was something small and metallic. A military challenge coin. Its emblem was unlike any unit she knew. A coiled serpent wrapped around a black star. On the reverse, a set of coordinates, half erased, but still legible enough to point her towards somewhere deep in the desert. She pocketed it. The fight was over, but the war was far from done. If they wanted to test her, she'd take their test apart piece by piece. The wind picked up, carrying sand over the bodies around her. By morning there would be no sign of what had happened here, but in her mind, every detail was burned in. She'd beaten the mud, she'd beaten the desert, and when the time came, she'd beat the man who thought he was writing her story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.